Today's book is Designing Language Courses, a Guide for Teachers by Kathleen Graves. So I read this for the reason that I expect most people read this, which was the Delta Module 3. I discovered this book a little bit late in Delta Module 3. I think I discovered this about the time I was writing the section on the syllabus. And this is one of the sources that's useful to cite for the syllabus section. But this is really gold for Delta Module 3. In fact, I wish I had known about this before I started. This, if anyone out there is thinking of taking Delta Module 3 in the very near future, and you're looking for like one book to read before you sign up for it to get your head around Module 3, I think this would be the book to read, at least as far as I know. If anyone else knows of a better book, let me know. But this is really Delta Module 3 in one book. I mean, it's got everything here. The needs assessment, the syllabus, the assessment plan, the goals and objectives, really everything you would need, I think, to write a good Delta Module 3 is in this book. Now, of course, you can't only rely on this book because they make you use 5 to 6 different sources for each section on the Delta Module 3. But if you could just rely on one book, I think this would have pretty much everything you would need in it, or just about. So, not to hit it too much over the head, but when I was doing the Delta Module 3, each section would catch me off guard a little bit. And this was partly just because of my personality. But, you know, I'd send in the section on the needs analysis, and then I'd be like, oh, okay, right, got to design a diagnostic test. And like, it was just, everything was hitting me as a surprise, and I didn't really have a clear picture of what the overall was or what was going to be coming. Which is another reason why I wish I would have read this book, because if you've got a better idea of how everything fits together at the beginning, it's going to make Delta Module 3 a lot easier for you. So that's my sales pitch. I don't really have a lot to say in terms of critiquing the content of this book, other than to say, you know, it was useful. I'll get into a little bit about maybe the style and readability of it. So this is part of a series. What's the name of the series? A teacher source book. So Teacher Source, I think, is the name of the series. And there's an introduction here by Donald Freeman, who is the series editor, and it sounds like he's also the husband of Kathleen Graves, based on her introduction. But Donald Freeman gives a rather interesting introduction to this, and I'll just quote directly from this because he does a very good job here. He says, I was driving just south of White River Junction. The snow had started falling in earnest. The light was flat, although it was mid-morning, making it almost impossible to distinguish the highway in the gray-white swirling snow. I turned on the radio, partly as a distraction, and partly to help me concentrate on the road ahead. The announcer was talking about the snow. The State Highway Department advises motorists to use extreme caution and to drive with their headlights on to ensure maximum visibility. He went on, his tone shifting slightly. Ray Burke, the state highway supervisor, just called to say that one of the plows almost hit a car just south of exit 6 because the person driving hadn't turned on his lights. He really wants people to put their headlights on because it is very tough to see in this stuff. So he uses that as an illustration of how it's useful to have both the technical information and a personal anecdote to illustrate it, to really sink in. And that is the philosophy of apparently this whole series of books, but definitely this book in particular. where everything is illustrated through teacher voices. So they give the theory and then they give some teacher voices. And they give the theory and then they give some teacher voices. And I think they are absolutely right. That does really help it to sink in. If it hadn't have been for that, it would have been a lot more dry and boring read, for one. And I'm not sure I would have absorbed as much of it for another. So I think they're very right to do that. The trade-off is it does take much longer to read through than if they were to just give you the information. So if you want a book that's just going to give the information, there's Syllabus Design by David Noonan, which I have also read cover to cover and reviewed in a previous video, and which I have to admit, I found it useful for quoting from in Delta Module 3. It's only a few short months later and I remember very little of this. I feel like this book is going to stick in my memory a lot more. So in this book, she talks about the different parts of syllabus design. And she's got a flow chart. Let me see if I can find that a moment. Flow chart when she talks about all the different components here. Sorry. Yeah, so course design, and it's in this circle because you can jump in at any point. So there's assessing needs, formulating goals and objectives, developing needs, designing an assessment plan, organizing the course, conceptualizing content, and around it goes. And then underlying that is defining the context and articulating beliefs. Now, each one of these makes their own separate chapter in the book. So there's a whole chapter on defining the context, a whole chapter on articulating beliefs, a whole chapter on conceptualizing content. Now, she makes it very clear you could jump into this at any point, but the way she's got the book lined up, the needs assessment doesn't come in until chapter 6. Now, the first chapter is just the introduction to course design, so that doesn't count. But you still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters before you get to assessing needs. Defining the context, articulating beliefs, conceptualizing content, and formulating goals and objectives. Sorry, that's 4 chapters before you get to assessing needs. Now, that's different than the way a lot of other course design books are laid out. For example, the Language Teaching Matrix by Jack Richards, another book that's very useful for Delta Module 3, starts off with assessing the needs. The needs assessment as the first thing that you do. And the Delta Module 3 as well. After you've written about the background for your specialty, the first thing you need to do is to assess the needs of the students. She says, yeah, that's the way it's traditionally done, and that is one way to do it. But she makes what I think is a very good point here, that you don't usually meet the students until the course is already underway. Or, you meet them on day 1. But before day 1, you need to prepare a lot of stuff. You don't just walk in on day 1 with nothing. So that's why she says defining the content, articulating beliefs, conceptualizing the content, and formulating the goals and objectives all come before the needs assessment. And of course, after the needs assessment, you need to go back and revise what you've done in the previous steps. And again, that's why it's this circular thing with the arrows going everywhere. One set of arrows going this way, one set of arrows going this way, and then the other underlined set of arrows. It's a bit messy with all these arrows going back and forth, but that's another point that she makes in the book, is that the process can be a bit messy. Yeah, what else? There are, in this book, in addition to there's the framework, the teacher's voices, and the investigation. And they've got it set up as a feature of this series of books. And this version I have here is a little bit hard to see, but you can see there's the, over here, in these little diamonds here, it tells what it is. So this is the investigation, which is questions, and then there's a framework, which is the technical information. And then there's the teachers' voices, where you get to hear teachers reflecting on how this actually went in their classes. The framework is a lot of things that you can do on your own. For example, this is just at random here, but 1.2. Before you read the next section, briefly write down or discuss with a colleague what you think this statement means. Designing a language course is a work in progress. Other ones of these investigations will ask you to go through textbooks you've been using, or ask you to look at a syllabus you're designing, or something like that. I don't know who does these. I suspect very few people actually do these things, and they're just in here as a gimmick. Occasionally I would take a couple minutes to reflect on them myself, but I was reading a lot of this book either in coffee shops or on my lunch break or something like that. So I wasn't going to stop and get out a pen and pencil and investigate a course book or do half the stuff they were asking me to do in here. If you're at all familiar with these types of professional development books, you know that these types of things are in them all the time. So I'm quite used to them by this point. But I just skipped over them. Yeah, what else do I want to say? This book is very useful for Delta Module 3. It's also useful for teachers who are in a position to design their own courses, which I think very few of us are these days. Most of us come in with a pre-made book, pre-made course, pre-selected textbook, and can adapt it maybe on the activity level, but don't have a lot of freedom to design our own assessments or make our own syllabus. I say we don't have the freedom to, and in a lot of cases that's just as well, huh? I mean, most teachers are happy to have an assessment already prepared for them where they don't have to design it. But if you were to design something from scratch, then this book would be the most useful for you. As it was in my context, I found it useful for the Delta Module 3. The other stuff is probably not going to be useful in my current job, may not be useful for me for quite some time, if ever. I just read through the whole thing just because I like to try and finish the whole book every now and again. But then there's a whole chapter on developing materials, which I don't know if you can see that I wrote right here in the margin. That's most useful to my context. And then after that is adapting a textbook, which is again something that's very useful in my context, where you're already given a textbook and you've got to think about how to adapt it. I did write here for chapter 9 again. I don't know if you can see that in the margins. Wow, a very long chapter. So chapter 9 is one of the longest chapters because there's so many different ways to adapt a textbook. And yeah, chapter 9 I think would be very useful for teachers in any situation. And then developing an assessment plan. This is another thing I really wished I had read before doing Delta Module 3. I mean, I still got by. I still got a pass in Delta Module 3, but this would have given me much more of a running start. Wrote in the column here, would have been very useful for Module 3. I think I'm going to cut this review off here. I've got a lot of stuff that I made notes on the margins of, but it's mostly nitpicks about small points here and there. As far as the book in general, I think I've said most of what I want to say about it. So, to sum up, highly recommended for Delta Module 3. I would recommend reading this book cover to cover before you start doing the Module 3. I wish I would have done that. That being said, I muddled a pass through anyways, so it's not essential. You can definitely do what I did and just muddle your way through, but would have been a lot smoother for me if I had read that whole book before I started.